Miyamoto Musashi, The Way of the Lone Sword, Blood on the Snow. The winter of war 4 years had passed since the wild orphan from Mimasaka had set out to find his destiny. Now, on the 15th day of the 9th month of the 5th year of Keicho, what Westerners would call October 1600, all Japan held its breath. Two titanic forces converged on a frozen valley called Sekigahara, carrying with them not just armies, but the very future of the nation. On one side marched Tokugawa Ieyasu, the cunning fox from the east, with his disciplined legions and his stony patience. On the other, Ishida Mitsunari led the Western coalition, a fragile alliance of proud daimyos united only by their common hatred of the ambitious Tokugawa. Between them, like grains of sand between the gears of fate, walked thousands of lesser samurai, desperate ronin, and young warriors thirsting for glory. Among the latter was Benosuke Hirata, or Miyamoto Musashi as he had begun to call himself, adopting the name of the province where his true personality had been born. Now 17, he had grown even taller, his shoulders broadened by constant swordplay, his eyes hardened by 4 years of bloody duels on the roads of Japan. He marched with the Western army not out of political loyalty, but for the simple reason that Mitsunari had promised gold and glory to those who distinguished themselves in battle. For Musashi, politics were irrelevant. He was only interested in the opportunity to test his skills on the greatest battlefield his generation would ever see. Winter had come early that year, and the Sekigahara Valley was already covered in a thin layer of snow that crunched beneath the feet of tens of thousands of men preparing to die. In the frigid air, the breath of horses created ghostly clouds, and the metal of their weapons gleamed like ice in the pale autumn sun. The eve of the apocalypse. On the night before the battle that would decide Japan's fate, rival camps stretched across the slopes of Sekigahara like terrestrial constellations. Thousands of campfires flickered in the darkness, each surrounded by men who knew many would never see another dawn. Some sharpened swords with the care of artisans, others wrote farewell letters that might never be delivered. Many simply gazed into the flames, lost in thoughts of distant families and dreams that might die with the sunrise. Musashi wasn't part of these melancholic rituals. While his comrades in arms prepared spiritually for death, he prepared technically for victory. He practiced slashes in the frigid air, his movements creating vapor trails as he adjusted every angle, every timing, every breath. For him, the coming battle wasn't an apocalypse, it was an opportunity. It was then that he met Matashi Chiro Hyoki, a young samurai of the same age, son of a respected family of the Ukita clan. Unlike Musashi, Matashi Chiro had grown up in gilded castles, trained by renowned masters, fed on premium rice, and educated in the Chinese classics. He was everything Musashi had never been, refined, cultured, born into the warrior aristocracy. "You train as if the battle were a personal duel," Matashi Chiro observed, approaching the young man practicing alone under the starlight. "But tomorrow we will not fight alone. There will be thousands of blades, archers, cavalry, firearms. All your individual expertise can be crushed by a stray bullet or a random arrow." Musashi paused in his exercises and studied the young aristocrat. He saw in him everything he despised: unearned privilege, honor inherited rather than forged, fear disguised as wisdom. "Perhaps for you, the battle is about survival," he replied, with a coldness that made the other instinctively recoil. "For me, it's about transcendence. Tomorrow I will discover if I am truly who I believe myself to be, or just another foolish young man destined to die in obscurity." Matashi Chiro felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night's chill. There was something in the young ronin's eyes that deeply disturbed him, a complete absence of fear, replaced by something that resembled hunger, a hunger for violence, for testing, for ultimate proof of superiority. "How can you not be afraid?" he asked, genuinely confused. "Because," said Musashi, resuming his exercises with hypnotic fluidity, "fear is for those who have something to lose. I only have something to gain." Dawn of carnage. The sun rose red over Sekigahara on the 15th day of the 9th month, tinting the snow with hues of unshed blood. The morning mist rose from the fields like ghosts anticipating the slaughter, and the air was so cold that each breath created clouds that dissipated like last prayers. Musashi awoke before the drum's call, already fully alert, like a predator sensing the approach of prey. Around him, men slowly rose, some shivering from the cold, others from fear, many of both. But he remained motionless, a statue of absolute concentration, absorbing every sound, every shift in the atmosphere, every sign of what was to come. Generals shouted orders that echoed through the valleys like distant thunder. Formations formed with the lethal precision of deadly dances rehearsed for centuries. Banners fluttered in the wind like dragons' tongues awakening for war. And everywhere, the metallic sound of thousands of swords being drawn simultaneously created a symphony that chilled the blood and set hearts ablaze. To the west, where Musashi had positioned himself, Kobayakawa Hideaki's troops occupied the heights, their spears gleaming like giant serpents' teeth. Ukita Hide's forces, including the young Matashichiro, whom Musashi had met the night before, formed the center of the battle line. And scattered among all the formations like drops of liquid mercury were the independent Ronin, masterless warriors who fought only for the promise of gold and the thirst for glory. When the drums finally sounded the signal to advance, 60,000 men began to move simultaneously, creating a noise that shook the earth itself. It was as if all the demons of hell had been unleashed at once, each screaming for blood and death. Musashi drew his two swords, one long, one short, and felt the world around him slow down. He was about to experience his first true battle, where death would come not from a single honorable opponent, but from 1,000 different directions, unpredictable and chaotic as a storm of steel. And deep down in his soul he smiled, the devil among mortals. When the lines collided, the sound was like a mountain collapsing. Thousands of blades met simultaneously, creating a metallic roar that drowned out the screams of the wounded and the commands of the officers. The virgin morning snow instantly turned into a red paste of blood and mud, speckled with fragments of shattered armor and chunks of human flesh. Amidst this organized hell, Musashi moved like a force of nature in human form. His two swords traced deadly patterns in the air, each cut calculated not only to kill, but to position himself for the next opponent. There was no waste in his movements, no energy wasted on unnecessary flourishes. It was the pure efficiency of death transformed into art. The first man he faced was a middle-aged veteran, covered in scars and wielding a spear longer than two people. It should have been a decisive advantage, but Musashi simply slipped under the spearhead like water over stone, and his blades met the man's neck before he could comprehend what had happened. The second was a young samurai from a noble family, armed with a master-forged katana and wearing armor worth more than an entire farm. They fought for perhaps 10 seconds, an eternity in a battle where death came in fractions of a moment. When it was over, the young aristocrat lay in the snow with his eyes open to the sky, his expensive armor transformed into an iron tomb. But it was the third confrontation that revealed the true nature of what Musashi was becoming. It was Matashichiro, the young man he had spoken to the night before, now covered in blood and mud, his eyes glazed with the horror of what he had witnessed. When he recognized Musashi, his face contorted into an expression of utter despair. "Please," he shouted over the roar of battle, "it doesn't have to be like this. We can pretend to fight, wait until it's all over." Musashi paused for a moment, studying the trembling youth before him. There was a part of him, a small, ever-shrinking part, that still remembered what it felt like to feel pity, but that part was quickly consumed by the fire burning in his pupils. "I'm sorry," he said, with a terrible gentleness in his voice, "but I need to know." "Know what?" "If I'm real." Musashi's blade moved so quickly that Matashichiro didn't even see it. He only felt for a split second the strange sensation of something warm running down his neck. Then only darkness, the treachery of the heavens. As the battle progressed, it became clear that something had gone terribly wrong with the Western Coalition's plans. The troops supposed to support the center of the battle line remained motionless on the hills, like spectators watching a bloody play. Kobayakawa Hideaki, whose descent from the heights should have crushed the Tokugawa eastern flank, kept his forces stationary like iron statues. Musashi, lost in the deadly trance of combat, initially failed to notice the treachery unfolding around him. He was too busy killing, his consciousness reduced to the hypnotic cycle of dodging, slashing, advancing, repeating. Around him, bodies piled like cordwood, and the snow had completely disappeared beneath a thick layer of frozen blood. But gradually, even in his state of controlled rage, he began to notice something was wrong. The screams around him were no longer of battle, but of despair. The men were no longer advancing, they were retreating. And in the frigid air echoed a sound that chilled his blood more than winter. The sound of an entire army collapsing. Kobayakawa's betrayal had doomed the Western coalition. Without the support of the hills, the central forces found themselves surrounded on three sides, crushed between the Tokugawa troops, advancing like a human avalanche. What had begun as an organized battle quickly degenerated into a disorganized massacre. Musashi saw men who had fought bravely for hours simply throw down their weapons and run. He saw proud samurai from ancient families fall to their knees and beg for mercy that would not come. He saw the very fabric of warrior honor unravel like silk in the rain, and amidst all this disintegration, he kept fighting. Not because he believed he could change the outcome of the battle. It was already obvious that the Western coalition was lost. He fought because to stop would mean admitting there was something greater than his individual will, something that could shatter the momentum of perfection he was building blow by blow. Around him, the retreat turned into a rout. But Musashi pressed on alone, an island of controlled violence in an ocean of desperate chaos. The taste of defeat. Reality finally dawned on him, when a musket ball passed so close to his head that he felt the heat of the heated metal sear his ear. Musashi awoke from his deathly trance and looked around, seeing for the first time the full extent of the disaster that had befallen the Western coalition. The battlefield was a sea of broken bodies and torn banners. The snow had completely disappeared beneath layers of blood, mud, and fragments of shattered armor. Thousands of men who had woken that morning thinking of glory and conquest now lay cold and silent, their dreams of immortality transformed into the most basic reality of mortality. Tokugawa troops advanced methodically across the field, wrapping up the wounded and collecting heads as trophies. There was no rush. The victory was so complete that they could afford efficiency over speed. For them, this was no longer a battle, but a macabre harvest. Musashi found himself alone on a small rise, surrounded by perhaps 20 samurai from the eastern forces. They all watched him with a mixture of respect and disbelief. They had seen how he had fought, seen the mountain of bodies he had created around him, but they also saw that he was just a young man, alone and exhausted, his swords dripping blood on the red snow. "Surrender!" shouted one of the enemy officers, a middle-aged man with scars that spoke of many battles. "You fought with honor. There is no dishonor in acknowledging defeat when it is inevitable." For a moment, Musashi considered the proposal. He felt fatigue weighing on his shoulders like lead armor. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of hours of relentless killing. And all around him, he saw only the futility of continued resistance. But then he remembered the words he had spoken the night before, that he had nothing to lose, only something to gain. And the greatest thing he could gain in that moment wasn't victory. It was knowledge. Knowledge of his own limits, of what he could do when all hope was gone. "I'm sorry," he said, assuming the fighting stance he had practiced thousands of times, "but I'm not finished learning yet." Sekigahara's final duel didn't last long. Not because Musashi was quickly defeated, but because he discovered that even 20 experienced men can be killed by someone with literally nothing to lose except the opportunity to discover how far he can go. When it was over, he was the only man alive on a hill covered in corpses. The ghost who walked. The silence that followed was more deafening than the roar of battle. Musashi stood amidst the carnage he had created, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air, his sword still dripping with blood, that was beginning to freeze to the metal. Around him, the last sounds of the Battle of Sekigahara died like distant echoes, the occasional screams of the wounded, the neighing of lost horses, the clang of looted armor. But he didn't move. He was experiencing something new and disturbing, the realization that he had transcended not only his previous limits, but perhaps the limits of what was humanly possible. He had killed so many men he'd lost count. He had fought for hours without stopping. And in the end, when he should have been dead or captured, he stood alone and victorious amidst a mountain of defeated adversaries. It wasn't possible, and yet, it had happened. Slowly, other figures began to appear around the rise where he stood. They weren't enemy soldiers. They had learned to keep a respectful distance. They were other survivors of the Western coalition, Ronin like himself, who had managed to escape the main massacre, and now looked at him with a mixture of reverence and terror. "You're not human," whispered one of them, a veteran with graying hair and scarred arms. "I've seen many battles, killed many men. But I've never seen anyone fight like you fought today." Musashi wiped his swords on the clothing of one of the dead and slowly sheathed them. Each movement was deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if he were sealing something within himself. "Maybe you're right," he said, in a voice that sounded strange even to his own ears, deeper, colder, as if something fundamental had shifted in his throat. "Maybe I'm not human anymore." He began to walk down the hill, stepping over the bodies he had created without looking down. The other survivors instinctively moved aside, creating a path for him to pass. It was as if they instinctively recognized that there was something different about him now, something that set him apart from the rest of humanity. As he walked across the battlefield toward the distant mountains, Musashi felt the transformation taking place within him. The young man who had come to Sekigahara seeking trial and glory had died on that hill. In his place walked something new, no longer a man searching for his identity, but a force of nature who had found his true purpose. The birth of the invincible. Snow began to fall again as Musashi finally left the Sekigahara Valley behind. Large heavy flakes quickly covered the evidence of the carnage, transforming the battlefield into a silent white landscape, where it was impossible to tell that thousands of men had died just hours before. He walked slowly, not out of fatigue, but out of a need to process what had happened to him. Sekigahara hadn't just been a battle, it had been a metamorphosis. The glory-hungry young man who had entered that valley had died among the bodies of his enemies. What had emerged was something purer, more focused, more dangerous. The defeat of the Western coalition meant that Japan now belonged to Tokugawa. It meant a new era had dawned, an era of enforced peace and rigid order. But for Musashi, Tokugawa's political victory was irrelevant. What mattered was what he had discovered about himself amidst the carnage. He had discovered that he had no limits, at least no limits that he could yet perceive. The road ahead forked. One path led back to the central provinces, where he could join the other surviving Ronin and perhaps find service with one of the new lords of the Tokugawa regime. The other led to the wild mountains, where he could roam freely, seeking worthy opponents and honing his skills away from the complications of politics. Musashi didn't hesitate. He took the path through the mountains. Behind him, the distant sounds of battle faded completely, replaced by the deep silence of snow falling on a transformed world. Ahead, the path wound through wild landscapes where he could test the limits of his new nature without outside interference. He didn't yet know that he would become known as the invincible swordsman, who would never lose a duel for the rest of his life. He didn't know that he would found a fencing school that would revolutionize the art of swordsmanship, or that he would write treatises on strategy that would be studied for centuries. All he knew was that Sekigahara had shown him a fundamental truth. He was born to be something more than human, and now finally free from the constraints of political loyalties and social obligations, he could discover exactly what that something more meant. The feral orphan of Miyamoto had died in the bloody snows of Sekigahara. In his place walked Miyamoto Musashi, and the world would never be the same again. The real journey was just beginning.